Chapter 47. The Kindreds win the Mote-House. The din and tumult still came from the north side of the marketplace, so that all the air was full of noise. And Face of God deemed that the thralls had gotten weapons into their hands and were slaying their masters. Now he lifted up his face, and put his hand on Folk-Mote's shoulder, and said in a loud voice, "Kinsman, it were well if our brother were to bid the banners into the Mote-House of the Wolf. And let all the host set itself in array before the said house, and abide till the chasers of the foe come to us thither. For I perceive that they are now become many, and are more than those of our kindred." Then Folk-Mote looked at him with kind eyes, and said, "Thou sayest well, brother, even so let it be." And he lifted up his sword, and Face of God cried out in a loud voice, "Forward, banners! Blow up horns! Fare we forth with victory!" So the host drew its ranks together in good order, and they all set forward, and old Stoneface took the sunbeam by the hand and led on behind Folk-Mote and the war leader. But when they came to the hall, then saw they how the steps that led up to the door were high and double, going up from each side without any railing or foolguard. And crowding the stairs and the platform thereof was a band of the Dusky Men, as many as could stand thereon, who shot arrows at the host of the Kindreds, howling like dogs, and chattering like apes. And arrows and spears came from the windows of the hall, yea, and on the very roof a score of these felons were riding the ridge and mocking like the trolls of old days. Now when they saw this they stayed a while, and men shielded them against the shafts, but the leaders drew together in front of the host, and Folk-Mote fell to speech, and his face was very pale and stern. For now he had had time to think of the case of the bride, and fierce wrath, and grief unholpen filled his soul. So he said, "Brothers, this is my business to deal with. For I see before me the stair that leadeth to the Mote-House of my people, and now would I sit there whereas my fathers sat, when peace was on the Dale, as once more it shall be tomorrow. Therefore up this stair will I go, and none shall hinder me, and let no man of the host follow me till I have entered into the hall, unless perchance I fall dead by the way, but stand ye still and look on." "Nay," said Face of God, "this is partly the business of the war leader. There are two stairs. Be content to take the southern one, and I will take the northern. We shall meet on the plain stone at the top." But Hall-Face said, "War leader, may I speak?" "Speak, brother," said Face of God. Said Hall-Face, "I have done but little today, war leader. I would stand by thee on the northern stair. So shall Folk-Mote be content, if he doeth two men's work who are not little-hearted." Said Face of God, "The doom of the war leader is that Folk-Mote shall fall on by the southern stair to slake his grief and increase his glory, and Face of God and Hall-Face by the northern. Haste to the work, O brothers." And he and Hall-Face went to their places, while all looked on. But the sunbeam, with her hand still in Stone-Face, she turned white to the lips, and stared with wild eyes before her, not knowing where she was. For she had deemed that the battle was over, and Face of God saved from it. But Folk-Mote tossed up his head and laughed, and cried out, "At last, at last." And his sword was in his hand, the sleep-thorn to wit, a blade of ancient fame. So now he let it fall and hang to his wrist by the leash, while he clapped his hands together and uttered the wolf whoop mightily, and all the men of the wolf that were in the host, and the Woodlanders withal, uttered it with him. Then he put his shield over his head and stood before the first of the steps, and the Dusky Men laughed to see one man come against them, though there was death in their hearts. But he laughed back at them in triumph, and set his foot on the step, and let Sleepthorn's point go into the throat of a dusky lord, and thrust amongst them, hewing right and left, and tumbling men over the edge of the stair, which was to them as the narrow path along the cliff-side that hangeth over the unfathomed sea. They hewed and thrust at him in turn. But so close were they packed that their weapons crossed about him, and one shielded him from the other, and they swayed staggering on that fearful verge, while the Sleepthorn crept here and there amongst them, lulling their hot fury. For, as desperate as they were, and fighting for death and not for life, they had a horror of him and of the sea of hatred below them, and feared where to set their feet, and he feared not at all. But from feet to sword point was but an engine of slaughter, while the heart within him throbbed with fury long held back as he thought upon the bride and her wounding, and all the wrongs of his people since their great undoing. So he smote and thrust, till him seemed the throng of foes thin before him, with his sword pommel he smote a lord of the dusky ones in the face, so that he fell over the edge amongst the spears of the kindred. Then he thrust the point of Sleepthorn towards the hall door through the breast of another, and then it seemed to him that he had but one before him. So he hove up the edges to cleave him down, but ere the stroke fell, close to his ears exceeding loud rang out the cry, "For the burg and the face! For the face, for the face!" And he drew aback a little, and his eyes cleared, and lo! It was Hall-Face the Tall, his long sword all reddened with battle, and beside him stood Face of God, silent and panting, his face pale with the fierce anger of the fight, and the weariness which was now at last gaining upon him. There stood those three with no other living man upon the plain of the stairs. Then Face of God turned shouting to the folk, and cried, "Forth now with the banners! For now is the wolf come home. On into the hall, O kindred of the gods!" Then poured the folk up over the stairs and into the hall of the wolf, the banners flapping over their heads. And first went the war leader and Folk-Mote and Hall-Face, and then the three delivered thralls, Wolfstone, Godswain, and Spearfist, and Dallach with them, though both he and Wolfstone had been hurt in the battle. And then came blended together the men of the face along with them of the wolf who had entered the Mote-Stead with them, and with these were Stoneface and Woodwonte and Baume, leading the sunbeam betwixt them. And now was she come to herself again, though her face was yet pale, and her eyes gleamed as she stepped across the threshold of the hall. But when a many were gotten in, and the first comers had had time to handle their weapons and look about them, a cry of the utmost wrath broke from Folk-Mote and those others who remembered the hall from of old. For wretched and befouled was that well-builded house, the hangings rent away. The goodly painted walls daubed and smeared with wicked tokens of the alien murderers, the floor, once bright with polished stones of the mountain, and strewn with sweet-smelling flowers, was now as foul as the den of the man-devouring troll of the heaths. From the fair carven roof of oak and chestnut beams hung ugly knots of rags and shapeless images of the sorcery of the Dusky Men. And furthermore, and above all, from the last tie-beam of the roof over the dais dangled four shapes of men-at-arms, whom the older men of the wolf knew at once for the embalmed bodies of their four great chieftains, who had been slain on the day of the great undoing. And they cried out with horror and rage as they saw them hanging there in their weapons as they had lived. There was the hostage of the earth, his shield painted with the green world circled with the worm of the sea. There was the older Folk-Mote, the uncle of the living man, bearing a shield with an oak and a lion done thereon. There was Wealthiker, on whose shield was done a golden sheaf of wheat. There was he who bore a name great from of old, Folk-Wolf to wit, bearing on his shield the axe of the hewer. There they hung, dusty, befouled, with sightless eyes and grinning mouths, in the dimmed sunlight of the hall, before the eyes of that victorious host, stricken silent at the sight of them. Underneath them on the dais stood the last remnant of the battle of the Dusky Men. And they, as men mad with coming death, shook their weapons, and with shrieking laughter mocked at the overcomers, and pointed to the long-dead chiefs, and called on them in the tongue of the Kindreds to come down and lead their dear kinsmen to the high seat. And then they cried out to the living warriors of the wolf, and bade them better their deed of slaying, and set to work to make alive again, and cause their kinsmen to live merry on the earth. With that last mock they handled their weapons and rushed howling on the warriors to meet their death, nor was it long denied them. For the sword of the wolf, the axe of the woodland, and the spear of the dale soon made an end of the dreadful lives of these destroyers of the folks. Chapter 48. Men sing in the Mote-House. Then strode the warriors of the wolf over the bodies of the slain on to the dais of their own hall. And Folk-Mote led the sunbeam by the hand, and now was his sword in its sheath, and his face was grown calm, though it was stern and sad. But even as he trod the dais comes a slim swain of the wolves twisting himself through the throng, and so mocketh way to Folk-Mote, and saith to him, "Chieftain, the alderman of Burgdale sendeth me hither to say a word to thee." Even this, which I am to tell to thee and the war leader both, it is most true that our kinswoman the bride will not die, but live. So help me, the warrior and the face. This is the word of the alderman. When Folk-Mote heard this, his face changed and he hung his head, and Face of God, who was standing close by, beheld him and deemed that tears were falling from his eyes onto the hall floor. As for him, he grew exceeding glad, and he turned to the sunbeam and met her eyes, and saw that she could scarce refrain her longing for him, and he was abashed for the sweetness of his love. But she drew close up to him, and spake to him softly and said, This is the day that mocketh amends, and yet I long for another day. When I saw thee coming to me that first day in shadowy vale, I thought thee so goodly a warrior that my heart was in my mouth. But now how goodly thou art! For the battle is over, and we shall live. Yea, said Face of God, and none shall begrudge us our love. Behold thy brother, the hard heart, the warrior, he weepeth because he hath heard that the bride shall live. Be sure then that she shall not gainsay him. O fair shall the world be tomorrow. But she said, O gold mane, I have no words. Is there no minstrelsy amongst us? Now by this time were many of the men of the Wolf and the Woodlanders gathered on the dais of the hall. And the Dalesmen noting this, and wotting that these men were now in their own Mote-House, withdrew them as they might for the press toward the nether end thereof. That the Sunbeam noted, and that all those about her save the war leader were of the kindreds of the Wolf and the Woodland, and, still speaking softly, she said to Face of God. Gold mane, meseemeth I am now in my wrong place. For now the wolf riseth up his head, but I am departing from him. Surely I should now be standing amongst my people of the face, whereto I am going ere long. He said, Beloved, I am now become thy kindred and thine home, and it is meet for thee to stand beside me. She cast her eyes adown and answered not. And she fell a pondering of how sorely she had desired that fair Dale, and now she would leave it, and be content and more than content. But now the kindreds had sundered, they upon the dais ranked themselves together there in the house which their fathers had builded. And when they saw themselves so meetly ordered, their hearts being full with the sweetness of hope accomplished and the joy of deliverance from death, song arose amongst them, and they fell to singing together. And this is somewhat of their singing. Now raise we the lay of the long coming day. Bright, white was the sun when we saw it begun. O'er its noon now we live. It hath ceased not to give. It shall give, and give more. From the wealth of its store. O fair was the yesterday. Kindly and good. Was the wasteland our guester, and kind was the wood. Though below us for reaping lay under our hand. The harvest of weeping, the grief of the land. Dumb cowered the sorrow, not daring to cry. On the help of tomorrow, the deed drawing nigh. All increase throve. In the dale of our love. There the ox and the steed fed down the mead. The grapes hung high 'twixt earth and sky. And the apples fell round the orchard well. Yet drear was the land there, and all was for naught. None put forth a hand there for what the year wrought. And raised it o'erflowing with gifts of the earth. For man's grief was growing beside of the mirth of the springs and the summers that wasted their wealth. And the birds, the newcomers, made merry by stealth. Yet here of old abode the bold. Nor had they wailed, though the wheat had failed. And the vine no more gave forth her store. Yea, they found the waste good. For the fearless of mood. Then to these, that were dwelling aloof from the dale, fared the wild wind telling the worst of the tale. As men bathed in the morning they saw in the pool the image of scorning, the throne of the fool. The picture was gleaming in helm and in sword. And shone forth its seeming from cups of the board. Forth then they came with the battle flame from the wood and the waste. And the dale did they haste. They saw the storm rise. And with untroubled eyes the war storm they met. and the rain ruddy wet. O'er the dale then was litten the candle of day. Night sorrow was smitten, and gloom fled away. How the grief shackles sunder! How many to mourn shall awaken and wonder how gladness was born? Oh, wont unto sorrow, how sweet unto you! Shall be pondering tomorrow what deed is to do. Fell many a man 'neath the edges wan, in the heat of the play that fashioned the day. Praise all ye then the death of men, and the gift of the aid of the unafraid. Oh, strong are the living men mighty to save, and good is their giving and gifts that we have. But the dead, they that gave us once, never again. Long and long shall they save us sore trouble and pain. O banner above us, O God of the strong! Love them as ye love us that bore down our wrong. So they sang in the hall. And there was many a man wept, as the song ended, for those that should never see the good days of the dale, and all the joy that was to be. And men swore, by all that they loved, that they would never forget those that had fallen in the winning of Silverdale. And that when each year the cups of memory went round, they should be no mere names to them, but the very men whom they had known and loved. Chapter 49. Dallach fareth to Rosedale, Crow telleth of his errand, the kindreds eat their meat in Silverdale. Now Dallach, who had gone away for a while, came back again into the hall. And at his back were a half-score of men who bore ladders with them. They were stout men, clad in scanty and ragged raiment, but girt with swords and bearing axes, those of them who were not handling the ladders. Men looked on them curiously, because they saw them to be of the roughest of the thralls. They were sullen and fierce-eyed to behold, and their hands and bare arms were flecked with blood. And it was easy to see that they had been chasing the fleers, and making them pay for their many torments of past days. But when Face of God beheld this he cried out, Ho, Dallach! Is it so that thou hast bethought thee to bring in hither men to fall to the cleansing of the hall, and to do away the defiling of the Dusky Men? Even so, war leader, said Dallach, also ye shall know that all battle is over in Silverstead. For the thralls fell in numbers not to be endured on the Dusky Men who had turned their backs to us, and hindered them from fleeing north. But though they have slain many, they have not slain all, and the remnant have fled by divers ways westway, that they may gain the wood and the ways to Rosedale. And the stoutest of the thralls are at their heels, and ever as they go fresh men from the fields join in the chase with great joy. I have gathered together of the best of them 250 well armed. And if thou wilt give me leave, I will get to me yet more, and follow hard on the fleers, and so get me home to Rosedale, for thither will these runaways to meet whatso of their kind may be left there. Also I would fain be there to set some order amongst the poor folk of mine own people, whom this day's work hath delivered from torment. And if thou wilt suffer a few men of the Dalesmen to come along with me, then shall all things be better done there. Luck go with thine hands, said Face of God. Take whomso thou wilt of the Burgdalers that have a mind to fare with thee to the number of 50, and send word of thy thriving to Folk-Mote, the chieftain of the Dale. As for us, meseemeth that we shall abide here no long while. How sayest thou, Folk-Mote, shall Dallach go? Then Folk-Mote, who stood close beside him, looked up and reddened somewhat, as a man caught heedless when he should be heedful. But he looked kindly on Face of God, and said, War leader, so long as thou art in the Dale which ye kindreds have won back for us, thou art the chieftain, and no other, and I bid thee do as thou wilt in this matter, and in all things. And I hereby give command to all my kindred to do according to thy will everywhere and always, as they love me, and indeed I deem that thy will shall be theirs, since it is only fools who know not their well-wishers. How say ye, kinsmen? Then those about cried out, Hail to Face of God! Hail to the Dalesmen! Hail to our friends! But Folk-Mote went up to Face of God, and threw his arms about him and kissed him, and he said therewithal, so that most men heard him. Herewith I kiss not only thee, thou goodly and glorious warrior. But this kiss and embrace is for all the men of the kindreds of the Dale and the shepherds, since I deem that never have men more valiant dwelt upon the earth. Therewith all men shouted for joy of him, and were exceeding glad. But Folk-Mote spake apart to face of God and said, Brother, I suppose that thou wilt deem it good to abide in this hall or anigh it, for hereabouts now is the heart of the host. But as for me, I would have leave to depart for a little. Since I have an errand, whereof thou mayest wot. Then face of God smiled on him, and said, Go, and all good go with thee, and tell my father that I would have tidings, since I may not be there. So he spake. Yet in his heart was he glad that he might not go to behold the bride lying sick and sorry. But Folk-Mote departed without more words. And in the door of the hall he met Crow the shaft speeder, who would have spoken to him, and given him the tidings, but Folk-Mote said to him, Do thine errand to the war leader, who is within the hall. And so went on his way. Then came Crow up the hall, and stood before face of God and said, War leader, we have done that which was to be done, and have cleared all the houses about the Mote-Stead. Moreover, by the reed of Dallach we have set certain men of the poor folk of the Dale, who are well looked to by the others, to the burying of the slain felons. And they be digging trenches in the fields on the north side of the Mote-Stead, and carry the carcasses thither as they may. But the slain whom they find of the kindreds do they array out yonder before this hall. In all wise are these men tame and biddable, save that they rage against the Dusky Men, though they fear them yet. As for us, they deem us gods come down from heaven to help them. So much for what is good, now have I an ill word to say. To wit, that in the houses whereas we have found many thralls alive, yet also have we found many dead. For amongst these murder carls were some of an evil sort, who, when they saw that the battle would go against them, rushed into the houses hewing down all before them man, woman, and child. So that many of the halls and chambers we saw running blood like to shambles. To be short, of them whom they were going to hew to the gods, we have found 13 living and 3 dead, of which latter is 1 woman, and of the living, 7 women. And all these, living and dead, with the leaden shackles yet on them wherein they should be burned. To all these and others whom we have found, we have done what of service we could in the way of victual and clothes, so that they scarce believe that they are on this lower earth. Moreover, I have with me 20 of them, who are men of some wits, and who know of the stores of victual and other wares which the felons had, and these will fetch and carry for you as much as ye will. Is all done rightly, war leader? Right well, said face of God, and we give thee our thanks therefore. And now it were well if these thy folk were to dight our dinner for us in some green field the nighest that may be, and thither shall all the host be bidden by sound of horn. Meantime, let us void this hall till it be cleansed of the filth of the dusky ones. But hereafter shall we come again to it, and light a fire on the holy hearth, and bid the gods and the fathers come back and behold their children sitting glad in the ancient hall. Then men shouted and were exceeding joyous. But face of God said once more, Bear ye a bench out into the marketplace over against the door of this hall, thereon will I sit with other chieftains of the kindreds, that whoso will may have recourse to us. So therewith all the men of the kindreds made their ways out of the hall and into the Mote-Stead, which was by this time much cleared of the slaughtered felons. And the bale for the burnt offering was now but smouldering, and a thin column of blue smoke was going up wavering amidst the light airs of the afternoon. Men were somewhat silent now, for they were stiff and weary with the morning's battle. And a many had been hurt withal, and on many there yet rested the after-grief of battle, and sorrow for the loss of friends and well-wishers. For in the battle had fallen 102 of the men of the host. And of these were 25 of the kindreds of the steer, the bull, and the bridge, who had made such valiant onslaught by the southern road. Of the shepherds died 10 save 3. For though they scattered the foe at once, yet they fell on with such headlong valor, rather than wisely, that many were trapped in the throng of the Dusky Men. Of the Woodlanders were slain 19. For hard had been the fight about them, and no man of them spared himself one whit. Of the men of the Wolf, who were but a few, fell 16 men, and all save 2 of these in face of God's battle. Of the Burgdale men whom Folk-Mote led, to wit, them of the face, the vine, and the sickle, were but 7 men slain outright. In this tale are told all those who died of their hurts after the day of battle. Therewithal many others were sorely hurt who mended, and went about afterwards hale and hearty. So as the folk abode in the marketplace, somewhat faint and weary, they heard horns blow up merrily, and Crow the shaft-speeder came forth and stood on the mound of the altar, and bade men fare to dinner, and therewith he led the way, bearing in his hand the banner of the golden bushel, of which house he was. And they followed him into a fair and great mead on the southwest of Silver-Stead, besprinkled about with ancient trees of sweet chestnut. There they found the board spread for them with the best of victual which the poor downtrodden folk knew how to dight for them, and especially was there great plenty of good wine of the sun-smitten bents. So they fell to their meat, and the poor folk, both men and women, served them gladly, though they were somewhat afeard of these fierce sword-wielders, the gods who had delivered them. The said thralls were mostly not of those who had fallen so bitterly on their fleeing masters, but were men and women of the households, not so roughly treated as the others, that is to say, those who had been wont to toil under the lash in the fields and the silver mines, and were as wild as they durst be. As for these waiting thralls, the men of the kindreds were gentle and blithe with them, and often as they served them would they stay their hands, and especially if they were women, and would draw down their heads to put a morsel in their mouths, or set the wine-cup to their lips. And they would stroke them and caress them, and treat them in all wise as their dear friends. Moreover, when any man was full, he would arise and take hold of one of the thralls, and set him in his place, and serve him with meat and drink, and talk with him kindly, so that the poor folk were much bewildered with joy. And the first that arose from table were the Sunbeam and Baume and Hallface, with many of the swains and the women of the Woodlanders, and they went from table to table serving the others. The Sunbeam had done off her armor, and went about exceeding fair and lovely in her kirtle, but Baume yet bore her hauberk, for she loved it, and indeed it was so fine and well-wrought that it was no great burden. Albeit she had gone down with the Sunbeam and other women to a fair stream thereby, and there had they bathed and washed themselves. And Baume's hurts, which were not great, had been looked to and bound up afresh, and she had come to table unhelmed, with a wreath of windflowers round her head. There then they feasted, and their hearts were strengthened by the meat and drink. And if sorrow were blended with their joy, yet were they high-hearted through both joy and sorrow, looking forward to the good days to be in the dales at the roots of the mountains, and the love and fellowship of folks and of houses. But as for Face of God, he went not to the meadow, but abode sitting on the bench in the marketplace, where were none else now of the kindred save the appointed warders. They had brought him a morsel and a cup of wine, and he had eaten and drunk. And now he sat there with Dalewarden lying sheathed across his knees, and seeming to gaze on the thralls of Silverdale busied in carrying away the bodies of the slain felons, after they had stripped them of their raiment and weapons. Yet indeed all this was before his eyes as a picture which he noted not. Rather he sat pondering many things, wondering at his being there in Silverdale in the hour of victory, longing for the peace of Burgdale and the bride chamber of the Sunbeam. Then went his thought out toward his old playmate lying hurt in Silverdale, and his heart was grieved because of her, yet not for long, though his thoughts still dwelt on her, since he deemed that she would live and presently be happy thenceforward for many years. So pondered Face of God in the marketplace of Silverdale. Chapter 50. Folk-Mote seeth the bride and speaketh with her. Now tells the tale of Folk-Mote, that he went his ways from the hall to the house where the bride lay. And the swain who had brought the message went along with him, and he was proud of walking beside so mighty a warrior, and he talked to Folk-Mote as they went. And the sound of his voice was irksome to the chieftain, but he made as though he hearkened. Yet when they came to the door of the house, which was just out of the place on the southern road, for thereby had the bride fallen to earth, he could withhold his grief no longer, but turned on the threshold and laid his head on the door-jamb, and sobbed and wept till the tears fell down like rain. And the boy stood by wondering, and wishing that Folk-Mote would forbear weeping, but durst not speak to him. In a while Folk-Mote left weeping and went in, and found a fair hall sore befouled by the felons, and in the corner on a bed covered with furs the wounded woman. And at first sight he deemed her not so pale as he looked to see her, as she lay with her long dark red hair strewed over the pillow, her head moving about wearily. A linen cloth was thrown over her body, but her arms lay out of it before her. Beside her sat the alderman, his face sober enough, but not as one in heavy sorrow, and anigh him was another chair as if someone had but just got up from it. There was no one else in the hall save 2 women of the Woodlanders, one of whom was cooking some potion on the hearth, and another was sweeping the floor anigh of bran or some such stuff, which had been thrown down to sop up the blood. So Folk-Mote went up to the bride, sorely dreading the image of death which she had grown to be, and sorely loving the woman she was and would be. He knelt down by the bedside, heeding Iron Face little, though he nodded friendly to him, and he held his face close to hers, but she had her eyes shut and did not open them till he had been there a little while. And then they opened and fixed themselves on his without surprise or change. Then she lifted her right hand, for it was in her left shoulder and side that she had been hurt, and slowly laid it on his head, and drew his face to hers and kissed it fondly, as she both smiled and let the tears run over from her eyes. Then she spake in a weak voice. Thou sayest, chieftain and dear friend, that I may not stand by thy victorious side today. And now, though I were fain if thou wouldst never leave me, yet needs must thou go about thy work, since thou art become the alderman of the folk of Silverdale. Yea, and even if thou wert not to go from me, yet in a manner should I go from thee. For I am grievously hurt, and I know by myself, and also the leeches have told me, that the fever is a-coming on me. So that presently I shall not know thee, but may deem thee to be a woman, or a hound, or the very wolf that is the image of the father of thy kindred, or even, it may be, someone else that I have played with time agone. Her voice faltered and faded out here, and she was silent a while. Then she said, So depart, kind friend and dear love, bearing this word with thee, that should I die, I call on Iron Face my kinsman to bear witness that I bid thee carry me to Bale in Silverdale, and lay mine ashes with the ashes of thy fathers. With whom thine own shall mingle at the last, since I have been of the warriors who have helped to bring thee aback to the land of thy folk. Then she smiled and shut her eyes and said, And if I live, as indeed I hope, and how glad I shall be to live, then shalt thou bring me to thy house and thy bed, that I may not depart from thee while both our lives last. And she opened her eyes and looked at him, and he might not speak for a while, so ravished as he was betwixt joy and sorrow. But the alderman arose and took a gold ring from off his arm, and spake. This is the gold ring of the god of the face, and I bear it on mine arm betwixt the folk and the god in all man-motes, and I bore it through the battle today. And it is as holy a ring as may be, and since ye are plighting troth, and I am the witness thereof, it were good that ye held this ring together and called the God to witness, who is akin to the God of the earth, as we all be. Take the ring, Folk-Mote, for I trust thee, and of all women now alive would I have this woman happy. So Folk-Mote took the ring and thrust his hand through it, and took her hand, and said, Ye fathers, thou God of the face, thou earth god, thou warrior, bear witness that my life and my body are plighted to this woman, the bride of the house of the steer. His face was flushed and bright as he spoke, but as his words ceased he noted how feebly her hand lay in his, and his face fell, and he gazed on her timidly. But she lay quiet, and said softly and slowly, O fathers of my kindred! O warrior and god of the earth! Bear witness that I plight my troth to this man, to lie in his grave if I die, and in his bed if I live. And she smiled on him again, and then closed her eyes. But opened them presently once more, and said, Dear friend, how fared it with Goldmane today? Said Folk-Mote, so well he did, that none might have done better. He fared in the fight as if he had been our father the warrior, he is a great chieftain. She said, Wilt thou give him this message from me, that in no wise he forget the oath which he swore upon the finger-ring as it lay on the sundial of the garden of the face? And say, moreover, that I am sorry that we shall part, and have between us such breadth of wild wood and mountain neck. Yea, surely will I give thy message, said Folk-Mote. And in his heart he rejoiced, because he heard her speak as if she were sure of life. Then she said faintly, It is now thy work to depart from me, and to do as it behoveth a chieftain of the people and the alderman of Silverdale. Depart, lest the leeches chide me, farewell, my dear. So he laid his face to hers and kissed her, and rose up and embraced Iron Face, and went his ways without looking back. But just over the threshold he met old Hallward of the House of the Steer, who was at point to enter, and he greeted him kindly. The old man looked on him steadily, and said, Tomorrow or the day after I will utter a word to thee, O chief of the wolf. In a good hour, said Folk-Mote, for all thy words are true. Therewith he gat him away from the house, and came to face of God, where he sat before the altar of the crooked sword, and now were the chiefs come back from their meat, and were sitting with him, there also were Woodfather and Woodwont. But Baume was with the sunbeam, who was resting softly in the fair meadow after all the turmoil. So men made place for Folk-Mote beside the war leader, who looked upon his face, and saw that it was sober and unsmiling, but not heavy or moody with grief. So he deemed that all was as well as it might be with the bride, and with a good heart fell to taking counsel with the others. And kindly and friendly were the reeds which they held there, with no gainsaying of man by man, for the whole folk was glad at heart. So there they ordered all matters duly for that present time, and by then they had made an end, it was past sunset, and men were lodged in the chief houses about the market-stead. Albeit, though they ate their meat with all joy of heart, and were merry in converse one with the other, the men of the wolf would by no means feast in their hall again till it had been cleansed and hallowed anew. Chapter 51. The dead borne to Bale, the Mote-House Re-Hallowed. On the morrow they bore to Bale their slain men, and therewithal what was left of the bodies of the 4 chieftains of the great undoing. They brought them into a most fair meadow to the west of Silverstead, where they had piled up a very great bale for the burning. In that meadow was the doom-ring and thingstead of the folk of the wolf, and they had hallowed it when they had first conquered Silverdale, and it was deemed far holier than the Mote-House aforesaid. Wherein the men of the kindred might hold no due court. But rather it was a feast hall, and a house where men had conversed together, and wherein precious things and tokens of the fathers were stored up. The thingstead in the meadow was flowery and well-grassed, and a little stream winding about thereby nearly cast a ring around it, and beyond the stream was a full fair grove of oak trees, very tall and ancient. There then they burned the dead of the host, wrapped about in exceeding fair raiment. And when the ashes were gathered, the men of Burgdale and the shepherds left those of their folk for the kindred to bury there in Silverdale. For they said that they had a right to claim such guesting for them that had helped to win back the dale. But when the burning was done and the bale quenched, and the ashes gathered and buried, and that was on the morrow, then men bore forth the banners of the jaws of the wolf, and the red hand, and the silver arm, and the golden bushel, and the ragged sword, and the wolf of the woodland. And with great joy and triumph they brought them into the Mote-House and hung them up over the dais, and they kindled fire on the holy hearth by holding up a disk of bright glass to the sun, and then they sang before the banners. And this is somewhat of the song that they sang before them. Why are ye wending? O whence and whither? What shineth over the fallow swords? What is the joy that ye bear in hither? What is the tale of your blended words? Know whither we wend, but here have we stayed us. Here by the ancient holy hearth. Long have the moons and the years delayed us. But here are we come from the heart of the dearth. We are the men of joy belated. We are the wanderers over the waste. We are but they that sat and waited, watching the empty winds make haste. Long, long we sat and knew no others, save alien folk and the foes of the road. Till late and at last we met our brothers. And needs must we to the old abode. For once on a day they prayed for guesting. And how were we then their bead to do? Wild was the waste for the people's resting. And deep the wealth of the dale we knew. Here were the boards that we must spread them. Down in the fruitful dale and deer. Here were the halls where we would bed them. And how should we tarry otherwhere? Over the waste we came together. There was the tangle athwart the way. There was the windstorm and the weather. The red rain darkened down the day. But that day of the days what grief should let us. When we saw through the clouds the dale-glad sun. We tore at the tangle that beset us. and stood at peace when the day was done. Hall of the happy, take our greeting. Bid thou the fathers come and see the folk signs on thy walls a meeting, and deem today what men we be. Look on the holy hearth new litten. How the sparks fly twinkling up aloof. How the wavering smoke by the sunlight smitten curls up around the beam-rich roof. For here once more is the wolf abiding, nor evermore from the dale shall wend, and never again his head be hiding, till all days be dark and the world have end. Chapter 52. Of the new beginning of good days in Silverdale. On the third day there was hightide and great joy amongst all men from end to end of the dale. And the delivered thralls were feasted and made much of by the kindreds, so that they scarce knew how to believe their own 5 senses that told them the good tidings. For none strove to grieve them and torment them. What they would, that did they, and they had all things plenteously, since for all was there enough and to spare of goods stored up for the Dusky Men, as corn and wine and oil and spices, and raiment in silver. Horses were there also, and neat and sheep and swine in abundance. Withal there was the good and dear land, the waxing corn on the acres, the blossoming vines on the hillside. And about the orchards and alongside the ways, the plum trees and cherry trees and pear trees that had cast their blossom and were overhung with little young fruit. And the fair apple trees blossoming, and the chestnuts spreading their boughs from their twisted trunks over the green grass. And there was the goodly pasture for the horses and the neat, and the tiny hill grass for the sheep. And beyond it all, the thicket of the great wood, with its unfailing store of goodly timber of ash and oak and holly and yoke elm. There need no man lack unless man compelled him, and all was rich enough and wide enough for the waxing of a very great folk. Now, therefore, men betook them to what was their own before the coming of the Dusky Men. And though at first many of the delivered thrall folk feasted somewhat above measure, and though there were some of them who were not very brisk at working on the earth for their livelihood, yet were the most part of them quick of wit and deft of hand, and they mostly fell to presently at their cunning, both of husbandry and handicraft. Moreover, they had great love of the kindreds, and especially of the Woodlanders, and strove to do all things that might pleasure them. And as for those who were dull and listless because of their many torments of the last 10 years, they would at least fetch and carry willingly for them of the kindreds. And these last grudged them not meat and raiment and house room, even if they wrought but little for it, because they called to mind the evil days of their thraldom, and bethought them how few are men's days upon the earth. Thus all things throve in Silverdale, and the days wore on toward the summer, and the Yuletide rest beyond it, and the years beyond and far beyond the winning of Silverdale. Chapter 53. Of the word which Hallward of the Steer had for Folk-Mote. But of the time then passing, it is to be said that the whole host abode in Silverdale in great mirth and good liking, till they should hear tidings of Dallach and his company, who had followed hot-foot on the fleers of the Dusky Men. And on the 10th day after the battle, Iron Face and his 2 sons and Stone Face were sitting about sunset under a great oak tree by that stream side which ran through the Mote-Stead. There also was Folk-Mote, somewhat distraught because of his love for the bride, who was now mending of her hurts. As they sat there in all content they saw folk coming toward them, 3 in number, and as they drew nigher they saw that it was old Hallward of the Steer, and the Sunbeam and Baume following him hand in hand. When they came to the brook Baume ran up to the elder to help him over the stepping stones, which she did as one who loved him, as the old man was stark enough to have waded the water waist deep. She was no longer in her war gear, but was clad after her wont of shadowy veil, in naught but a white woolen kirtle. So she stood in the stream beside the stones, and let the swift water ripple up over her ankles, while the elder leaned on her shoulder and looked down upon her kindly. The Sunbeam followed after them, stepping daintily from stone to stone, so that she was a fair sight to see. Her face was smiling and happy, and as she stepped forth on to the green grass the colour flushed up in it, but she cast her eyes adown as one somewhat shamefaced. So the chieftains rose up before the leader of the Steer, and Folk-Mote went up to him, and greeted him, and took his hand and kissed him on the cheek. And Hallward said, "Hail to the chiefs of the kindred, and my earthly friends. Then Folk-Mote bade him sit down by him, and all the men sat down again, but the sunbeam leaned her back against a sapling ash hard by, her feet set close together, and Bale went to and fro in short turns, keeping well within earshot. Then said Hallward, Folk-Mote, I have prayed thy kinswoman Bale to lead me to thee, that I might speak with thee, and it is good that I find my kinsmen of the face in thy company, for I would say a word to thee that concerns them somewhat. Said Folk-Mote, guest, and warrior of the steer, thy words are ever good, and if this time thou comest to ask aught of me, then shall they be better than good. Said Hallward, tell me, Folk-Mote, hast thou seen my daughter the bride today? Yea, said Folk-Mote, reddening. What didst thou deem of her state? Said Hallward. Said Folk-Mote, thou knowest thyself that the fever hath left her, and that she is mending. Hallward said, in a few days belike we shall be wending home to Burgdale, when deemest thou that the bride may travel, if it were but on a litter? Folk-Mote was silent, and Hallward smiled on him and said, wouldst thou have her tarry, O chief of the wolf? So it is, said Folk-Mote, that it might be labour lost for her to journey to Burgdale at present. Thinkest thou? Said Hallward, hast thou a mind then that if she goeth she shall speedily come back hither? It has been in my mind, said Folk-Mote, that I should wed her. Wilt thou gainsay it? I pray thee, Iron Face my friend, and ye Stone Face and Hall Face, and thou, Face of God, my brother, to lay thy words to mine in this matter. Then said Hallward stroking his beard, there will be a seat missing in the hall of the steer, and a sore lack in the heart of many a man in Burgdale if the bride come back to us no more. We looked not to lose the maiden by her wedding. For it is no long way betwixt the house of the steer and the house of the face. But now, when I arise in the morning and miss her, I shall take my staff and walk down the street of Burgstead. For I shall say, the maiden hath gone to see Iron Face my friend, she is well in the house of the face. And then shall I remember how that the wood and the wastes lie between us. How sayest thou, alderman? A sore lack it will be, said Iron Face, but all good go with her. Though whiles shall I go hatless down Burgstead Street, and say, now will I go fetch my daughter the bride from the house of the steer. While many a day's journey shall lie betwixt us. Said Hallward, I will not beat about the bush, Folk-Mote, what gift wilt thou give us for the maiden? Said Folk-Mote, whatever is mine shall be thine. And whatsoever of the dale the kindred and the poor folk begrudge thee not, that shalt thou have, and deemest thou that they will begrudge thee aught? Is it enough? Hallward said, I wot not, chieftain, see thou to it. Bale, my friend, bring hither that which I would have from Silverdale for the house of the steer in payment for our maiden. Then Bale came forward speedily, and went up to the sunbeam, and led her by the hand in front of Folk-Mote and Hallward and the other chieftains. Then Folk-Mote started, and leapt up from the ground. For, sooth to say, he had been thinking so wholly of the bride, that his sister was not in his mind, and he had had no deeming of whither Hallward was coming, though the others guessed well enough, and now smiled on him merrily. When they saw how wild Folk-Mote stared. As for the sunbeam, she stood there blushing like a rose in June, but looking her brother straight in the face, as Hallward said. Folk-Mote, chief of the wolf, since thou wouldst take our maiden the bride away from us, I ask thee to make good her place with this maiden. So that the house of the steer may not lack, when they who are wont to wed therein come to us and pray us for a bedfellow for the best of their kindred. Then became Folk-Mote smiling merry like unto the others, and he said, Chief of the steer, this gift is thine, together with aught else which thou mayst desire of us. Then he kissed the sunbeam, and said, Sister, we looked for this to befall in some fashion. Yet we deemed that he that should lead thee away might abide with us for a moon or two. But now let all this be, since if thou art not to bear children to the kindreds of Silverdale, yet shalt thou bear them to their friends and fellows. And now choose what gift thou wilt have of us to keep us in thy memory. She said, The memory of my people shall not fade from me, yet indeed I ask thee for a gift, to wit, Bale, and the 2 sons of Wood father that are left since Wood wicked was slain.
And belike the elder and his wife will be fain to go with their sons, and ye will not hinder them. Even so shall it be done, said Folk-Mote, and he was silent a while, pondering, and then he said. Lo you, friends! Doth it not seem strange to you that peace sundereth as well as war? Indeed I deem it grievous that ye shall have to miss your well-beloved kinswoman. And for me, I am now grown so used to this woman my sister, though at whiles she hath been masterful with me, that I shall often turn about and think to speak to her, when there lie long days of wood and waste betwixt her voice and mine. The sunbeam laughed in his face, though the tears stood in her eyes, as she said, Keep up thine heart, brother, for at least the way is shorter betwixt Burgdale and Silverdale than betwixt life and death, and the road we shall learn belike. Said Hallface, So it is that my brother is no ill woodman, as ye learned last autumn. Ironface smiled, but somewhat sadly, for he beheld face of God, who had no eyes for anyone save the sunbeam. And no marvel was that, for never had she looked fairer. And forsooth the war leader was not utterly well pleased, for he was deeming that there would be delaying of his wedding, now that the sunbeam was to become a maid of the steer. And in his mind he half deemed that it would be better if he were to take her by the hand and lead her home through the wild wood, he and she alone, and she looked on him shyly, as though she had a deeming of his thought. Albeit he knew it might not be, that he, the chosen war leader, should trouble the peace of the kindred, for he wot that all this was done for peace' sake. So Hallward stood forth and took the sunbeam's right hand in his, and said, Now do I take this maiden, sunbeam of the kindred of the wolf, and lead her into the house of the steer, to be in all ways one of the maidens of our house. And to wed in the blood wherein we have been wont to wed. Neither from henceforth let anyone say that this woman is not of the blood of the steer, for we have given her our blood, and she is of us duly and truly. Thereafter they talked together merrily for a little, and then turned toward the houses, for the sun was now down. And as they went Ironface spake to his son, and said, Goldmane, wilt thou verily keep thine oath to wed the fairest woman in the world? By how much is this one fairer than my dear daughter who shall no more dwell in mine house? Said Face of God, Yea, father, I shall keep mine oath, for the gods, who know much, know that when I swore last Yule I was thinking of the fair woman going yonder beside Hallward, and of none other. Ah, son! Said Ironface, why didst thou beguile us? Hadst thou but told us the truth then? Yea, alderman, said Face of God smiling, and how thou wouldest have raged against me then, when thou hast scarce forgiven me now. In sooth, father, I feared to tell you all, I was young, I was one against the world. Yea, and even that was sweet to me, so sorely as I loved her hast thou forgotten, father? Ironface smiled, and answered not. And so came they to the house wherein they were guested. Chapter 54. Tidings of Dallach, a Folk-Mote in Silverdale. 3 days thereafter came 2 swift runners from Rosedale with tidings of Dallach. In all wise had he thriven, and had slain many of the runaways, and had come happily to Rosedale, therein by the mere shaking of their swords had they all their will. For there were but a few of the dusky warriors in the dale, since the more part had fared to the slaughter in Silverstead. Now therefore had Dallach been made alderman of Rosedale. And the Burgdalers who had gone with him should abide the coming thither of the rest of the Burgdale host, and meantime of their coming should uphold the new alderman in Rosedale. Howbeit Dallach sent word that it was not to be doubted but that many of the Dusky Men had escaped to the woods, and should yet be the death of many a mother's son, unless it were well looked to. And now the more part of the Burgdale men and the shepherds began to look toward home, albeit some amongst them had not been ill pleased to abide there yet a while. For life was exceeding soft to them there, though they helped the poor folk gladly in their husbandry. For especially the women of the dale, of whom many were very goodly, hankered after the fair-faced tall Burgdalers, and were as kind to them as might be. Forsooth not a few, both carles and queens, of the old thrall folk prayed them of Burgdale to take them home thither, that they might see new things and forget their old torments once for all, yea, even in dreams. The Burgdalers would not gainsay them, and there was no one else to hinder,
so that there went with the Burgdale men at their departure hard on 50 of the Silverdale folk who were not of the Kindreds. And now was a great Folk-Mote holden in Silverdale, whereto the Burgdale men and the shepherds were bidden, and thereat the war leader gave out the morrow of the morrow for the day of the departure of the host. There also were the matters of Silverdale duly ordered. The men of the Wolf would have had the Woodlanders dwell with them in the fair builded stead, and take to them of the goodly stone houses there what they would. But this they nay said, choosing rather to dwell in scattered houses, which they built for themselves at the utmost limit of the tillage. Indeed, the most abode not even there a long while, for they loved the wood and its deeds. So they went forth into the wood, and cleared them space to dwell in, and builded them halls such as they loved, and fell to their old woodland crafts of charcoal burning and hunting, wherein they throve well. And good for Silverdale was their abiding there, since they became a sure defence and stout outpost against all foemen. For the rest, wheresoever they dwelt, they were guest-cherishing and blithe, and were well beloved by all people. And they wedded with the other houses of the children of the Wolf. As to the other matters whereof they took read at this Folk-Mote, they had mostly to do with the warding of the Dale, and the learning of the delivered thralls to handle weapons duly. For men deemed it most like that they would have to meet other men of the kindred of the felons, which indeed fell out as the years wore. Moreover, Folk-Mote, by the rede of Stone-Face, sent messengers to the plain and the cities, unto men whom he knew there, doing them to wit of the tidings of Silverdale, and how that a peaceful and guest-loving people, having good store of wares, now dwelt therein, so that chapmen might have recourse thither. Lastly spake Folk-Mote and said, Guests and brothers in arms, we have been looking about our new house, which was our old one, and therein we find great store of wares which we need not, and which we can but use if ye use them. Of your kindness therefore we pray you to take of those things what ye can easily carry. And if ye say the way is long, as indeed it is, since ye are bent on going through the wood to Rosedale, and so on to Burgdale, yet shall we furnish you with beasts to bear your goods, and with such wains as may pass through the woodland ways. Then rose up Fox of Upton and said, O Folk-Mote, and ye men of the Wolf, be it known unto you, that if we have done anything for your help in the winning of Silverdale, we have thus done that we might help ourselves also. So that we might live in peace henceforward, and that we might have your friendship and fellowship therewithal, so that here in Silverdale might wax a mighty folk who joined unto us should be strong enough to face the whole world. Such are the redes of wise men when they go a-warring. But we have no will to go back home again made rich with your wealth, this hath been far from our thought in this matter. And there went up a murmur from all the Burgdalers saying his word. But Folk-Mote took up the word again and spake. Men of Burgdale and the sheepcotes, what ye say is both manly and friendly. Yet, since we look to see a road made plain through the woodland betwixt Burgdale and Silverdale, and that often ye shall face us in the feast hall, and whiles stand beside us in the fray, we must needs pray you not to shame us by departing empty-handed. For how then may we look upon your faces again? Stone-Face, my friend, thou art old and wise, therefore I bid thee to help us herein, and speak for us to thy kindred, that they naysay us not in this matter. Then stood up Stone-Face and said, Forsooth, friends, Folk-Mote is in the right herein, for he may look for anger from the wights that come and go betwixt his kindred and the gods, if they see us faring back giftless through the woods. Moreover, now that ye have seen Silverdale, ye may wot how rich a land it is of all good things, and able to bring forth enough and to spare. And now meseemeth the gods love this folk that shall dwell here. And they shall become a mighty folk, and a part of our very selves. Therefore let us take the gifts of our friends, and thank them blithely. For surely, as saith Folk-Mote, henceforth the wood shall become a road betwixt us, and the thicket a halting place for friends bearing goodwill in their hands. When he had spoken, men said his words and forbore the gifts no longer. And the Folk-Mote sundered in all loving kindness. Chapter 55. Departure from Silverdale. On morrow of the morrow were the Burgdale men and they of the shepherds gathered together in the market-stead early in the morning, and they were all ready for departure. And the men of the Wolf and the Woodlanders, and of the delivered thralls a great many, stood round about them grieving that they must go. There was much talk between the folk of the Dale and the guests, and many promises were given and taken to come and go betwixt the two Dales. There also were the men of the thrall folk who were to wend home with the Burgdalers. And they had been stuffed with good things by the men of the Kindreds, and were as fain as might be. As for the Sunbeam, she was somewhat out of herself at first, being eager and restless beyond her wont, and yet at whiles weeping right when she called to mind that she was now leaving all those things, the gain whereof had been a dream to her both waking and sleeping for these years past. But at last, as she stood in the door of the Mote-House, and beheld all the throng of folk happy and friendly, it came over her that she herself had done her full share to bring all this about. And that all those pleasant places of Silverdale now full of the goodly life of man would be there even as she had striven for them, and that they would be a part of her left behind, though she were dwelling otherwhere. Therewithal she said to herself that it was now her part to wield the life of men in Burgdale, and begin once more her days of a chieftain and a swayer of the folk, and the life of a stirring woman, which the edge of the sword and the need of the hard handplay had taken out of her hands for a while, making her as a child in the hands of the strong wielders of the blades. So now she became calm once more, and her face was clad again with the full measure of that majesty of beauty which had once overawed face of God amidst his love of her. And folk beheld her and marvelled at her fairness, and said, She hath an inward sorrow at leaving the fair dale wherein her fathers dwelt, and where her mother's ashes lie in earth. Albeit now was her sorrow but little, and much was her hope, and her foresight of days to be. Though all the dale, yea, every leaf and twig of it whereby her feet had ever passed, and each stone of the fair houses, was to her as a picture that she could look on from henceforth for ever. Of the bride it is to be said that she was now much mended, and she caused men bear her on a litter out into the marketplace, that she might look on the departure of her folk. She had seen face of God once and again since the day of battle, and each time had been kind and blithe with him, and for Iron Face, she loved him so well that she was ever loath to let him depart from her, save when Folk-Mote was with her. And now was the alderman standing beside her, and she said to him, Friend and kinsman, this is the day of departure, and though I must needs abide behind, and am content to abide, yet doth mine heart ache with the sundering. For tomorrow when I wake in the morning there will be no more sending of a messenger to fetch thee to me. Indeed, great hath been the love between me and my people, and naught hath come between us to mar it. Now, kinsman, I would see Goldmane, my cousin, that I may bid him farewell, for who knoweth if I shall see him again hereafter. Then went Iron Face and found face of God where he was speaking with Folk-Mote and the chieftains, and said to him, Come quickly, for thy cousin the bride would speak with thee. Face of God reddened, and paled afterwards, but he went along with his father silently, and his heart beat as he came and stood before the litter whereas the bride lay, clad all in white and propped up on fair cushions of red silk. She was frail to look on, and worn and pale yet, but he deemed that she was very happy. She smiled on him, and reached out her hand and said, Welcome once more, cousin. And he held her hand and kissed it, and was nigh weeping, so sore was he beset by a throng of memories concerning her and him in the days when they were little. And he bethought him of her loving kindness of past days, beyond that of most children, beyond that of most maidens, and how there was nothing in his life but she had a share in it, till the day when he found the hall on the mountain. So he said to her, Kinswoman, is it well with thee? Yea, she said, I am now nigh whole of my hurts. He was silent a while, then he said, And otherwise art thou merry at heart? Yea, indeed, said she. Yet thou wilt not find it hard to deem that I am sorry of the sundering betwixt me and Burgdale. Again was he silent, and said in a while, Dost thou deem that I wrought that sundering? She smiled kindly on him and said, Goldmane, my playmate, thou art become a mighty warrior and a great chief, but thou art not so mighty as that. Many things lay behind the sundering which were neither thou nor I. Yet, said he, it was but such a little time agone that all things seemed so sure, and we to both of us was the outlook happy. Let it be happy still, she said, now begrudging is gone. Belike the sundering came because we were so sure, and had no defence against the wearing of the days, even as it fareth with a folk that hath no foes. He smiled and said, even as it hath befallen thy folk, O bride, a while ago. She reddened, and reached her hand to him, and he took it and held it, and said, Shall I see thee again as the days were? Said she, O chieftain of the folk, thou shalt have much to do in Burgdale, and the way is long. Yet would I have thee see my children. Forget not the token on my hand which thou holdest. But now get thee to thy folk with no more words, for after all, playmate, the sundering is grievous to me, and I would not spin out the time thereof. Farewell. He said no more, but stooped down and kissed her lips, and then turned from her, and took his ways to the head of the host, and fell to asking and answering, and bidding and arraying. And in a little time was his heart dancing with joy to think of the days that lay before him, wherein now all seemed happy. So was all arrayed for departure when it lacked 3 hours of noon. As Folk-Mote had promised, there were certain light wains drawn by bullocks abiding the departure of the host, and of sumpter bullocks and horses no few, and all these were laden with fair gifts of the Dale, as silver, and raiment, and weapons. There were many things fair wrought in the time of the sorrow, that henceforth should see but little sorrow. Moreover, there was plenty of provision for the way, both meal and wine, and sheep and neat. And all things as fair as might be, and well arrayed. It was the shepherds who were to lead the way, and after them were arrayed the men of the vine and the sickle, then they of the steer, the bridge, and the bull. And lastly the house of the face, with old Stoneface leading them. The sunbeam was to journey along with the house of the steer, which had taken her in as a maiden of their blood. And though she had so much liefer have fared with the house of the face, yet she went meekly as she was bidden, as one who has gotten a great thing, and will make no stir about a small one. Along with her were Wood-father and Wood-mother, and Wood-wise, now whole of his hurt, and Wood-wont, and Bow-may. Save Bow-may, they were not very joyous, for they were fain of Silverdale, and it irked them to leave it. Moreover, they also had liefer have gone along with the house of the war-leader. Last of all went those people of the once thralls of the Dusky Men who had cast in their lot with the Burgdalers, and they were exceeding merry. And especially the women of them, they were chattering like the stairs in the autumn evening, when they gather from the fields and the tall elm trees before they go to roost. Now all the men of the Dale, both of the Kindreds and of the thrall folk, made way for the host and its havings, that they might go their ways down the Dale. Albeit the Woodlanders clung close to the line of their ancient friends, and with them, as men who were sorry for the sundering, were Wolfstone and Godswain and Spearfist. But the chiefs, they drew around Folk-Mote a little beside the way. Now Redcoat of Waterless, who had been hurt, and was now whole again, cast his arms about Folk-Mote and kissed him, and said, All the way hence to Burgdale will I sow with good wishes for thee and thine. And especially for my dear friend Godswain of the Silver Arm. And I would wish and long that they might turn into spells to draw thy feet to usward, for we love thee well. In like wise spake other of the Burgdalers. And Folk-Mote was kind and blithe with them, and he said, Friends, forget ye not that the way is no longer from you to us than it is from us to you. One half of this matter it is for you to deal with. True is that, said Redbeard of the Knolls, but look you, Folk-Mote, we be but simple husbandmen, and may not often stir from our meadows and acres. Even now I bethink me that May is amidst us, and I am beginning to be drawn by the thought of the haysel. Whereas thou, and therewith he reddened, I doubt that thou hast little to do save the work of chieftains, and we know that such work is but little missed if it be undone. Thereat Folk-Mote laughed. And when the others saw that he laughed, they laughed also, else had they forborne for courtesy's sake. But Folk-Mote answered, Nay, chief of the sickle, I am not altogether a chieftain, now we have gotten us peace. And somewhat of a husbandman shall I be. Moreover, doubt ye not that I shall do my utmost to behold the fair Dale again, for it is but mountains that meet not. Now spake Face of God to Folk-Mote, smiling and somewhat softly, and said, Is all forgiven now, since the day when we first felt each other's arms? Yea, all, said Folk-Mote. Now hath befallen what I foretold thee in shadowy vale, that thou mightest pay for all that had come and gone, if thou wouldest but look to it.
Indeed thou wert angry with me for that saying on that eve of shadowy veil. But see thou, in those days I was an older man than thou, and might admonish thee somewhat, but now, though but few days have gone over thine head, yet many deeds have abided in thine hand, and thou art much aged. Anger hath left thee, and wisdom hath waxed in thee. As for me, I may now say this word, may the folk of Burgdale love the folk of Silverdale as well as I love thee, then shall all be well. Then Face of God cast his arms about him and kissed him, and turned away toward Stoneface and Hallface his brother, where they stood at the head of the array of the face. And even therewith came up the alderman somewhat sad and sober of countenance, and he pushed by the war leader roughly and would not speak with him. And now blew up the horns of the shepherds, and they began to move on amidst the shouting of the men of Silverdale, yet were there amongst the Woodlanders those who wept when they saw their friends verily departing from them. But when they of the foremost of the host were gotten so far forward that the men of the face could begin to move, lo! There was Reedsman with his fiddle amongst the leaders. And he had done a man's work in the day of battle, and all looked kindly on him. About him on this morn were some who had learned the craft of singing well together, and knew his minstrelsy, and he turned to these and nodded as their array moved on, and he drew his bow across the strings, and straightway they fell a-singing. Even as it might be thus. Back again to the dear dale where Borne was the kindred. Here wend we all living, and liveth our mirth. Here afoot fares our joyance, whatever men hind read. Through all wrath of the heavens, all storms of the earth. O true, we have left here a part of our treasure. The ashes of stout ones, the stems of the shield. But the bold lives they spended have sown us new pleasure. Fair tales for the telling in fold and on field. For as oft as we sing of their edges upheaving, when the yellowing windows shine forth o'er the night, their names unforgotten with song interweaving, shall draw forth dear drops from the depths of delight. Or when down by our feet the grey sickles are lying, and behind us is curling the suppertide smoke, know which shall they grudge us the joyance undying. Remembrance of men that put from us the yoke. When the huddle of ewes from the fells we have driven, and we see down the dale the grey reach of the roof, we shall tell of the gift in the battle joy given. All the fierceness of friends that drave sorrow aloof. Once then we lamented, and mourned them departed. Once only, no oftener. Henceforth shall we fling their names up aloft, when the merriest hearted. To the fathers unseen of our life days we sing. Then was there silence in the ranks of men. And many murmured the names of the fallen as they fared on their way from out the marketplace of Silverstead. Then once more Reedsman and his mates took up the song. Come tell me, O friends, for whom bedeth the maiden? Wet foot from the river ford down in the dale. For whom hath the goodwife the ox wagon laden? With the babble of children, brown-handed and hale. Come tell me for what are the women abiding? Till each on the other aweary they lean. Is it loitering of evil that thus they are chiding? The slow-footed bearers of sorrow unseen? Nay, yet were they toiling if sorrow had worn them. Or hushed had they bided with lips parched and wan. The birds of the air other tidings have borne them. How glad through the wood goeth man beside man. Then fare forth, O valiant, and loiter no longer. Then the cry of the cuckoo when May is at hand. Late waxeth the springtide, and daylight grows longer. And nightly the star-street hangs high o'er the land. Many lives, many days for the dale do ye carry. When the host breaketh out from the thicket unshorn, it shall be as the sun that refuseth to tarry. On the crown of all mornings, the midsummer morn. Again the song fell down till they were well on the western way down Silverdale. And then Reedsman handled his fiddle once more, and again the song rose up, and such like were the words which were borne back into the marketplace of Silverstead. And yet what is this, and why fare ye so slowly? While our echoing halls of our voices are dumb, and abideth unlitten the hearth brand the holy, and the feet of the kind fare afield till we come. For not yet through the wood and its tangle ye wander. Now skirt we no thicket, no path by the mere.
Far aloof for our feet leads the dale road out yonder. Full fair is the morning, its doings all clear. There is not now our feet on the highway delaying. Save the friend's loving kindness, the sundering of speech. The well-willer's word that ends words with the saying. The loath to depart while each looketh on each. Fare on then, for naught are ye laden with sorrow. The love of this land do ye bear with you still. In 2 dales of the earth for today and tomorrow. Is waxing the oak tree of peace and goodwill. Thus then they departed from Silver Dale, even as men who were a portion thereof, and had not utterly left it behind. And that night they lay in the wild wood not very far from the dale's end, for they went softly, faring amongst so many friends. Chapter 56. Talk upon the wild wood way. On the morrow morning when they were on their way again, Face of God left his own folk to go with the house of the steer a while, and amongst them he fell in with the sunbeam going along with Baume. So they greeted him kindly, and Face of God fell into talk with the sunbeam as they went side by side through a great oak wood, where for a space was plain greensward bare of all underwood. So in their talk he said to her, What deemest thou, my speech friend, concerning our coming back to guest in Silver Dale one day? The way is long, she said. That may hinder us but not stay us, said Face of God. That is sooth, said the sunbeam. Said Face of God, What things shall stay us? Or deemest thou that we shall never see Silverdale again? She smiled, Even so I think thou deemest, Gold Mane. But many things shall hinder us besides the long road. Said he, Yea, and what things? Thinkest thou, said the sunbeam, that the winning of Silverstead is the last battle which thou shalt see? Nay, said he, nay. Shall thy dale our dale be free from all trouble within itself henceforward? Is there a wall built round it to keep out for ever storm, pestilence, and famine, and the waywardness of its own folk? So it is as thou sayest, quoth Face of God, and to meet such troubles and overcome them, or to die in strife with them, this is a great part of a man's life. Yea, she said, and hast thou forgotten that thou art now a great chieftain, and that the folk shall look to thee to use thee many days in the year? He laughed and said, So it is. How many days have gone by since I wandered in the wood last autumn, that the world should have changed so much? Many deeds shall now be in thy days, she said, and each deed as the corn of wheat from which cometh many corns. And a man's days on the earth are not over many. Then farewell, Silverdale, said he, waving his hand toward the north. War and trouble may bring me back to thee, but it may be naught else shall. Farewell. She looked on him fondly but unsmiling, as he went beside her strong and warrior-like. 3 paces from him went Baume, barefoot, in her white kirtle, but bearing her bow in her hand. A leash of arrows was in her girdle, her quiver hung at her back, and she was girt with a sword. On the other side went Wood-Wont and Wood-Wise, lightly clad but weaponed. Wood-Mother was riding in an ox-wain just behind them, and Wood-Father went beside her bearing an axe. Scattered all about them were the men of the steer, gaily clad, bearing weapons, so that the oak wood was bright with them, and the glades merry with their talk and singing and laughter, and before them down the glades went the banner of the steer. And the white beast led them the nearest way to Burgdale. Chapter 57. How the host came home again. It was 14 days before they came to Rosedale. For they had much baggage with them, and they had no mind to weary themselves, and the wood was nothing loathsome to them, whereas the weather was fair and bright for the more part. They fell in with no mishap by the way. But 1,003 of runaways joined themselves to the host, having watched their goings and wotting that they were not foemen. Of these, some had heard of the overthrow of the Dusky Men in Silverdale, and others not. The Burgdalers received them all, for it seemed to them no great matter for 100 or so of newcomers to the Dale. But when the host was come to Rosedale, they found it fair arid lovely. And there they met with those of their folk who had gone with Dallach. But Dallach welcomed the Kindreds with great joy, and bade them abide. For he said that they had the less need to hasten, since he had sent messengers into Burgdale to tell men there of the tidings. albeit they were mostly loath to tarry. Yet when he lay hard on them not to depart as men on the morrow of a guild feast, they abode there 3 days, and were as well guested as might be. And on their departure they were laden with gifts from the wealth of Rosedale by Dallach and his folk. Before they went their ways Dallach spake with face of God and the chiefs of the Dalemen, and said, Ye have given me much from the time when ye found me in the wood a naked wastrel. Yet now I would ask you a gift to lay on the top of all that ye have given me. Said face of God, Name the gift, and thou shalt have it, for we deem thee our friend. I am no less, said Dallach, as in time to come I may perchance be able to show you. But now I am asking you to suffer a score or 2 of your men to abide here with me this summer, till I see how this folk newborn again is like to deal with me. For pleasure and a fair life have become so strange to them, that they scarce know what to do with them, or how to live, and unless all is to go awry, I must needs command and forbid, and though belike they love me, yet they fear me not. So that when my commandment pleaseth them, they do as I bid, and when it pleaseth them not, they do contrary to my bidding, for it hath got into their minds that I shall in no case lift a hand against them, which indeed is the very sooth. But your folk they fear as warriors of the world, who have slain the Dusky Men in the marketplace of Mote-Stead. And they are of alien blood to them, men who will do as their friend biddeth, think our folk, against them who are neither friends or foes. With such help I shall be well holpen. In such wise spake Dallach. And face of God and the chiefs said that so it should be, if men could be found willing to abide in Rosedale for a while. And when the matter was put abroad, there was no lack of such men amongst the younger warriors, who had noted that the Dale was fair amongst Dales and its women fairer yet amongst women. So 20 of the Burgdale men abode in Rosedale, no one of whom was of more than 25 winters. Forsooth divers of them set up house in Rosedale, and never came back to Burgdale, save as guests. For a 50 were wedded in Rosedale before the year's ending. And 7 more, who had also taken to them wives of the goodliest of the Rosedale women, betook them the next spring to the Burg of the Runaways, and there built them a stead, and drew a garth about it, and dug and sowed the banks of the river, which they called Ingleborn. And as years passed, this same stead throve exceedingly, and men resorted thither both from Rosedale and Burgdale, for it was a pleasant place. And the land, when it was cured, was sweet and good, and the wood thereabout was full of deer of all kinds. So their stead was called Ingleborn after the stream, and in latter days it became a very goodly habitation of men. Moreover, some of the once enthralled folk of Rosedale, when they knew that men of their kindred from Silverdale were going home with the men of Burgdale to dwell in the Dale, prayed hard to go along with them. For they looked on the Burgdalers as if they were new gods of the earth. The Burgdale chiefs would not gainsay these men either, but took with them 70 from Rosedale, men and women, and promised them dwelling and livelihood in Burgdale. So now with good hearts the host of Burgdale turned their faces toward their well-beloved Dale, and they made good diligence, so that in 3 days' time they were come anigh the edge of the woodland wilderness. Thither in the eventide, as they were making ready for their last supper and bed in the wood, came 3 men and 2 women of their folk, who had been abiding their coming ever since they had had the tidings of Silverdale and the battles from Dallach. Great was the joy of these messengers as they went from company to company of the warriors, and saw the familiar faces of their friends, and heard their wonted voices telling all the story of battle and slaughter. And for their part the men of the host feasted these stay-at-homes, and made much of them. But one of them, a man of the house of the face, left the host a little after nightfall, and bore back to Burgstead at once the tidings of the coming home of the host. Albeit since Dallach's tidings of victory had come to the Dale, the dwellers in the steads of the countryside had left Burgstead and gone home to their own houses, so that there was no great multitude abiding in the thorp. So early on the morrow was the host astir, but ere they came to Wild Lake's way, the shepherd folk turned aside westward to go home, after they had bidden farewell to their friends and fellows of the Dale. For their souls longed for the sheepcotes in the winding valleys under the long grey downs, and the garths where the last year's ricks shouldered up against the old stone gables, and where the daws were busy in the tall unfrequent ash trees. And the green flowery meadows adown along the bright streams, where the crowfoot and the pagels were blooming now, and the harebells were in flower about the thorn bushes at the down's foot. Whence went the savour of their blossom over sheepwalk and water meadow. So these went their ways with many kind words, and 2 hours afterwards all the rest of the host stood on the level ground of the portway. But presently were the ranks of war disordered and broken up by the joy of the women and children, as they fell to drawing goodman or brother or lover out of the throng to the way that led speediest to their homesteads and halls. For the war leader would not hold the host together any longer, but suffered each man to go to his home, deeming that the men of Burgdale, and chiefly they of the face and the steer, would suffice for a company if any need were. And they would be easily gathered to meet any hap. So now the men of the middle and lower dale made for their houses by the road and the lanes and the meadows, and the men of the upper dale and Burgdale went their ways along the portway toward their halls, with the throng of women and children that had come out to meet them. And now men came home when it was yet early, and the long day lay before them. And it was, as it were, made giddy and cumbered with the exceeding joy of return, and the thought of the day when the fear of death and sundering had been ever in their hearts. For these new hours were full of the kissing and embracing of lovers, and the sweetness of renewed delight in beholding the fair bodies so sorely desired, and hearkening the soft wheedling of longed-for voices. There were the cups of friends beneath the chestnut trees, and the talk of the deeds of the fighting men, and of the heavy days of the home-abiders, many a tale told oft and o'er again. There was the singing of old songs and of new, and the beholding the well-loved nook of the pleasant places, which death might well have made not for them. And they were sweet with the fear of that which was past, and in their pleasantness was fresh promise for the days to come. So amid their joyance came evening and nightfall. And though folk were weary with the fullness of delight, yet now for many their weariness led them to the chamber of love before the rest of deep night came to them to make them strong for the happy life to be begun again on the morrow. House by house they feasted, and few were the lovers that sat not together that even. But face of God and the sunbeam parted at the door of the house of the face. For needs must she go with her new folk to the house of the steer, and needs must face of God be amongst his own folk in that hour of high tide, and sit beside his father beneath the image of the God with the ray-begirt head. Chapter 58. How the Maiden Ward was held in Burgdale. Now May was well worn when the host came home to Burgdale. And on the very morrow of men's homecoming they began to talk eagerly of the midsummer weddings, and how the Maiden Ward would be the greatest and fairest of all yet seen. Whereas battle and the deliverance from battle stir up the longing and love both of men and maidens. Much also men spake of the wedding of face of God and the sunbeam, and needs must their wedding abide to the time of the Maiden Ward at midsummer, and needs also must the sunbeam go on the ward with the other brides of the folk. So then must face of God keep his soul in patience till those few days were over, doing what work came to hand, and he held his head high among the people, and was well looked to of every man. In all matters the sunbeam helped him, both in doing and in forbearing, and now so wonderful and rare was her beauty, that folk looked on her with somewhat of fear, as though she came from the very folk of the gods. Indeed she seemed somewhat changed from what she had been of late. She was sober of demeanor during these last days of her maidenhood, and sat amongst the kindred as one communing with herself, of few words she was and little laughter. But her face clear, not overcast by any gloom or shaken by passion, soft and kind was she in converse with others, and sweet were the smiles that came into her face if others' faces seemed to crave for them. For it must be said that as some folk eat out their hearts with fear of the coming evils, even so was she feeding her soul with the joy of the days to be, whatever trouble might fall upon them, whereof belike she foreboded some. So wore the days toward midsummer, when the wheat was getting past the blossoming, and the grass in the mown fields was growing deep green again after the shearing of the scythe, when the leaves were most and biggest. When the roses were beginning to fall, when the apples were reddening, and the skins of the grapeberries gathering bloom. High aloft floated the light clouds over the dale, deep blue showed the distant fells below the ice mountains. The waters dwindled, all things sought the shadow by daytime, and the twilight of even and the twilight of dawn were but sundered by 3 hours of half-dark night. So in the bright forenoon were 17 brides assembled in the gate of Burgdale, but of the rest of the dale were 23 looked for, and with these was the sunbeam, her face as calm as the mountain lake under a summer sunset. While of the others many were restless, and babbling like April throstles. And not a few talked to her eagerly, and in their restless love of her dragged her about hither and thither. No men were to be seen that morning. For such was the custom, that the carles either departed to the fields and the acres, or abode within doors on the morn of the day of the maiden ward. But there was a throng of women about the gate and down the street of Burgdale, and it may well be deemed that they kept not silence that hour. So fared the brides of Burgdale to the place of the maiden ward on the causeway, whereto were come already the other brides from steads up and down the dale, or were even then close at hand on the way. And among them were Longcoat and her 2 fellows, with whom Face of God had held converse on that morning whereon he had followed his fate to the mountain. There then were they gathered under the cliff wall of the portway. And by the roadside had their grooms built them up bowers of green boughs to shelter them from the sun's burning, which were thatched with bulrushes, and decked with garlands of the fairest flowers of the meadows and the gardens. Forsooth they were a lovely sight to look on, for no fairer women might be seen in the world, and the eldest of them was scant of 25 winters. Every maiden was clad in as goodly raiment as she might compass. Their sleeves and gown hems and girdles, yea, their very shoes and sandals were embroidered so fairly and closely, that as they shifted in the sun they changed color like the kingfisher shooting from shadow to sunshine. According to due custom every maiden bore some weapon. A few had bows in their hands and quivers at their backs, some had not but a sword girt to their sides, some bore slender shafted spears, so as not to overburden their shapely hands. But to some it seemed a merry game to carry long and heavy thrust spears, or to bear great war axes over their shoulders. Most had their flowing hair coiffed with bright helms, some had burdened their arms with shields. Some bore steel hauberks over their linen smocks, almost all had some piece of war gear on their bodies. And one, to wit, Steedlinden of the Sickle, a tall and fair damsel, was so arrayed that no garment could be seen on her but bright steel war gear. As for the sunbeam, she was clad in a white kirtle embroidered from throat to hem with work of green boughs and flowers of the goodliest fashion, and a garland of roses on her head. Dale Warden himself was girt to her side by a girdle fair wrought of golden wire, and she bore no other weapon or war gear, and she let him lie quiet in his scabbard, nor touched the hilts once. Whereas some of the other damsels would be ever drawing their swords out and thrusting them back. But all noted that goodly weapon, the yoke-fellow of so many great deeds. There then on the portway, between the water and the rock wall, rose up plenteous and gleeful talk of clear voices shrill and soft. And whiles the maidens sang, and whiles they told tales of old days, and whiles they joined hands and danced together on the sweet summer dust of the highway. Then they mostly grew aweary, and sat down on the banks of the road or under their leafy bowers. Noon came, and therewithal goodwives of the neighbouring dale, who brought them meat and drink, and fruit and fresh flowers from the teeming gardens. And thereafter for a while they nursed their joy in their bosoms, and spake but little and softly while the day was at its hottest in the early afternoon. Then came out of Burgdale men making semblance of chapmen with a wain bearing wares, and they made as though they were wending down the portway westward to go out of the dale. Then arose the weaponed maidens and barred the way to them, and turned them back amidst fresh springing merriment. Again in a while, when the sun was westering and the shadows growing long, came herdsmen from down the dale driving meat, and making as though they would pass by into Burgdale, but to them also did the maidens gainsay the road. So that needs must they turn back amidst laughter and mockery, they themselves also laughing and mocking. And so at last, when the maidens had been all alone a while, and it was now hard on sunset, they drew together and stood in a ring, and fell to singing. And one gold may of the house of the bridge, a most sweet singer, stood amidst their ring and led them. And this is somewhat of the meaning of their words. The sun will not tarry. Now changeth the light. Fail the colours that marry the day to the night. Amid the sun's burning bright weapons we bore. For this eve of our earning comes once and no more. For today hath no brother in yesterday's tide. And tomorrow no other alike it doth hide. This day is the token of oath and behest, that ne'er shall be broken through ill days and best. Here the troth hath been given, the oath hath been done, to the folk that hath thriven well under the sun. And the gifts of its giving our troth day shall win, are the dale for our living and dear days therein. O sun, now thou wanest, yet come back and see, amidst all that thou gainest how gainful are we. O witness of sorrow wide over the earth, rise up on the morrow to look on our mirth. Thy blooms art thou bringing back ever for men, and thy birds are singing each summer again. But to men little-hearted what winter is worse than thy summers departed that bore them the curse. And e'en such art thou knowing where thriveth the year, and good is all growing save thraldom and fear. Not such be our lovers' hearts drawing anigh, while yet thy light hovers aloft in the sky. Lo the seeker, the finder of death in the blade. What lips shall be kinder on lips of mine laid? La he that hath driven back tribes of the south. Sweet-breathed is thine even, but sweeter his mouth. Come back from the sea then, O sun. Come aback. Look adown, look on me then, and ask what I lack. Come many a morrow to gaze on the dale. And if e'er thou sayest sorrow remember its tale. For 'twill be of a story to tell how men died, in the garnering of glory that no man may hide. O sun sinking under, O fragrance of earth, O heart, O the wonder whence longing has birth. So they sang, and the sun sank indeed. And amidst their singing the eve was still about them, though there came a happy murmur from the face of the meadows and the houses of the thorp aloof. But as their song fell they heard the sound of footsteps a many on the road. So they turned and stood with beating hearts in such order as when a band of the valiant draw together to meet many foes coming on them from all sides, and they stand back to face all comers. And even therewith, their raiment gleaming amidst the gathering dusk, came on them the young men of the dale newly delivered from the grief of war. Then in very deed the fierce mouths of the raisers of the war-shout were kind on the faces of tender maidens. Then went spear and axe and helm and shield clattering to the earth, as the arms of the newcomers went round about the bodies of the brides, weary with the long day of sunshine, and glee and loving speech. And the maidens suffered the young men to lead them whither they would, and twilight began to draw around about them as the maiden band was sundered. Some, they were led away westward down the portway to the homesteads thereabout. And for divers of these the way was long to their halls, and they would have to wend over long stretches of dewy meadows, and hear the night wind whisper in many a tree. And see the east begin to lighten with the dawn before they came to the lighted feast that awaited them. But some turned up the portway straight towards Burgdale, and short was their road to the halls where even now the lights were being kindled for their greeting. As for the sunbeam, she had been very quiet the day long, speaking as little as she might do, laughing not at all, and smiling for kindness' sake rather than for merriment. And when the grooms came seeking their maidens, she withdrew herself from the band, and stood alone amidst the road nigher to Burgstead than they. And her heart beat hard, and her breath came short and quick, as though fear had caught her in its grip, and indeed for one moment of time she feared that he was not coming to her. For he had gone with the other grooms to that gathered band, and had passed from one to the other, not finding her, till he had got him through the whole company, and beheld her awaiting him. Then indeed he bounded toward her, and caught her by the hands, and then by the shoulders, and drew her to him, and she nothing loath, and in that while he said to her, "Come then, my friend, lo thou. They go each their own way toward the halls of their houses, and for thee have I chosen a way over the footbridge yonder, and over the dewy meadows on this best even of the year." "Nay, nay," she said, "it may not be. Surely the Burgstead grooms look to thee to lead them to the gate, and surely in the house of the face they look to see thee before any other. Nay, Goldmane, my dear, we must needs go by the portway." He said, "We shall be home but a very little while after the first, for the way I tell of is as short as the portway. But hearken, my sweet.
When we are in the meadows we shall sit down for a minute on a bank under the chestnut trees, and thence watch the moon coming up over the southern cliffs. And I shall behold thee in the summer night, and deem that I see all thy beauty. Which yet shall make me dumb with wonder when I see it indeed in the house amongst the candles. Oh nay, she said, by the portway shall we go, the torch-bearers shall be abiding thee at the gate. Spake face of God, then shall we rise up and wend first through a wide treeless meadow, wherein amidst the night we shall behold the kine moving about like odorous shadows. And through the greyness of the moonlight thou shalt deem that thou sayest the pink colour of the eglantine blossoms, so fragrant they are. Oh nay, she said, but it is meet that we go by the portway. But he said, then from the wide meadow come we into a close of corn, and then into an orchard close beyond it. There in the ancient walnut tree the owl sitteth breathing hard in the night time. But thou shalt not hear him for the joy of the nightingales singing from the apple trees of the close. Then from out of the shadowed orchard shall we come into the open town meadow, and over its daisies shall the moonlight be lying in a grey flood of brightness. Short is the way across it to the brim of the weltering water, and across the water leath the fair garden of the face. And I have dight for thee there a little boat to waft us across the night dark waters, that shall be like wavering flames of white fire where the moon smites them, and like the void of all things where the shadows hang over them. There then shall we be in the garden, beholding how the hall windows are yellow, and hearkening the sound of the hall glee borne across the flowers and blending with the voice of the nightingales in the trees. There then shall we go along the grass paths whereby the pinks and the cloves and the lavender are sending forth their fragrance, to cheer us, who faint at the scent of the overworn roses, and the honey sweetness of the lilies. All this is for thee, and for naught but for thee this even, and many a blossom whereof thou knowest not shall grieve if thy foot tread not thereby tonight. If the path of thy wedding which I have made, be void of thee, on the even of the chamber of love. But lo! At last at the garden's end is the yew walk arched over for thee, and thou canst not see whereby to enter it. But I know it, and I lead thee into and along the dark tunnel through the moonlight, and thine hand is not weary of mine as we go. But at the end shall we come to a wicket, which shall bring us out by the gable end of the hall of the face. Turn we about its corner then, and there are we blinking on the torches of the torch-bearers, and the candles through the open door, and the hall ablaze with light and full of joyous clamour. Like the Bale fire in the dark night kindled on a ness above the sea by fisher-folk remembering the gods. Oh nay, she said, but by the portway must we go, the straightest way to the gate of Burgdale. In vain she spake, and knew not what she said. For even as he was speaking he led her away, and her feet went as her will went, rather than her words, and even as she said that last word she set her foot on the first board of the footbridge. And she turned aback one moment, and saw the long line of the rock wall yet glowing with the last of the sunset of midsummer, while as she turned again, lo! Before her the moon just beginning to lift himself above the edge of the southern cliffs, and betwixt her and him all Burgdale, and face of God moreover. Thus then they crossed the bridge into the green meadows, and through the closes and into the garden of the face and unto the hall door. And other brides and grooms were there before them, for 6 grooms had brought home brides to the house of the face, but none deemed it amiss in the war leader of the folk and the love that had led him. And old Stoneface said, too many are the rows of beeskeps in the gardens of the dale that we should begrudge wayward lovers an hour's waste of candlelight. So at last those twain went up the sunbright hall hand in all their loveliness, and up onto the dais, and stood together by the middle seat. And the tumult of the joy of the kindred was hushed for a while as they saw that there was speech in the mouth of the war leader. Then he spread his hands abroad before them all and cried out, How then have I kept mine oath, whereas I swore on the holy boar to wed the fairest woman of the world? A mighty shout went rattling about the timbers of the roof in answer to his word, and they that looked up to the gable of the hall said that they saw the ray-ringed image of the god smile with joy over the gathered folk. But spake Iron Face unheard amidst the clamour of the hall, How fares it now with my darling and my daughter, who dwelleth amongst strangers in the land beyond the wild wood? Chapter 59. The behest of Face of God to the bride accomplished, a Mote-Stead appointed for the 3 folks, to wit, the men of Burgdale,
the shepherds, and the children of the wolf. 3 years and 2 months thereafter. 3 hours after noon in the days of early autumn, came a wain tilted over with precious webs of cloth, and drawn by 8 white oxen, into the marketplace of Silverstead, 70 of spearmen of the tallest, clad in goodly war-gear. Went beside it, and much people of Silverdale thronged about them. The wain stayed at the foot of the stair that led up to the door of the Mote-House, and there lighted down therefrom a woman goodly of fashion, with wide grey eyes, and face and hands brown with the sun's burning. She had a helm on her head and a sword girt to her side, and in her arms she bore a yearling child. And there was come Bale with the second man-child born to face of God. She stayed not amidst the wondering folk, but hastened up the stair, which she had once seen running with the blood of men. The door was open, and she went in and walked straightway, with the babe in her arms, up the great hall to the dais. There were men on the dais, amidmost sat Folk-Mote, little changed since the last day she had seen him, yet fairer, she deemed, than of old time. And her heart went forth to meet the chieftain of her folk, and the glad tears started in her eyes and ran down her cheeks as she drew near to him. By his side sat the bride, and her also Bale deemed to have waxed goodlier. Both she and Folk-Mote knew Bale ere she had gone half the length of the hall, and the bride rose up in her place and cried out Bale's name joyously. With these were sitting the elders of the Wolf and the Woodlanders, the more part of whom Bale knew well. On the dais also stood aside a score of men weaponed, and looking as if they were awaiting the word which should send them forth on some errand. Now stood up Folk-Mote and said, Fair greeting and love to my friend and the daughter of my folk. How farest thou, Bale, best of all friendly women? How fareth my sister, and face of God my brother? And how is it with our friends and helpers in the goodly dale? Said Bale, It is well both with all those and with me. And my heart laughs to see thee, Folk-Mote, and to look on the elders of the valiant, and our lovely sister the bride. But I have a message for thee from face of God, wilt thou that I deliver it here? Yes surely, said Folk-Mote, and came forth. And took her hand, and kissed her cheeks and her mouth. The bride also came forth and cast her arms about her, and kissed her, and they led her between them to a seat on the dais beside Folk-Mote. But all men looked on the child in her arms and wondered what it was. But Bale took the babe, which was both fair and great, and set it on the knees of the bride, and said, Thus saith face of God, friend and kinswoman, well-beloved playmate, the gift which thou badest of me in sorrow do thou now take in joy. And do all the good thou wouldest to the son of thy friend. The ring which I gave thee once in the garden of the face, give thou to Bale, my trusty and well-beloved, in token of the fulfillment of my behest. Then the bride kissed Bale again, and fell to fondling of the child, which was loath to leave Bale. But she spake again, To thee also, Folk-Mote, I have a message from face of God, who saith, Mighty warrior, friend and fellow, all things thrive with us, and we are happy. Yet is there a hollow place in our hearts which grieveth us, and only thou and thine may amend it. Though whiles we hear tell of thee, yet we see thee not, and fain were we, might we see thee, and what if the said tales be true? Wilt thou help us somewhat herein, or wilt thou leave us all the labor? For sure we be that thou wilt not say that thou rememberest us no more, and that thy love for us is departed. This is his message, Folk-Mote, and he would have an answer from thee. Then laughed Folk-Mote and said, Sister Bale, sayest thou these weaponed men hereby? Yea, she said. Said he, These men bear a message with them to face of God my brother. Crow the shaft speeder, stand forth and tell thy friend Bale the message I have set in thy mouth, every word of it. Then Crow stood forth and greeted Bale friendly, and said, Friend Bale, this is the message of our alderman, friend and helper, in the dale which thou hast given to us do all things thrive. Neither are we grown old in 3 years wearing, nor are our memories worsened. We long sore to see you and give you guesting in Silverdale, and one day that shall befall. Meanwhile, know this, that we of the wolf and the woodland, mindful of the earth that bore us, and the pit whence we were digged, have a mind to go see shadowy vale once in every 3 years.
And there to hold high tide in the ancient hall of the wolf, and sit in the doom-ring of our fathers. But since ye have joined yourselves to us in battle, and have given us this dale, our health and wealth, without price and without reward, we deem you our very brethren, and small shall be our hall glee, and barren shall our doom-ring seem to us. Unless ye sit there beside us. Come then, that we may rejoice each other by the sight of face and sound of voice, that we may speak together of matters that concern our welfare, so that we 3 kindreds may become one folk. And if this seem good to you, know that we shall be in shadowy vale in a half-month as wearing. Grieve us not by forbearing to come. Lo, Bale, this is the message, and I have learned it well, for well it pleaseth me to bear it. Then said Folk-Mote, What sayst thou to the message, Bale? It is good in all ways, said she, but is it timely? May our folk have the message and get to shadowy vale, so as to meet you there? Yes surely, said Folk-Mote, for our kinsmen here shall take the road through shadowy vale, and in 4 days' time they shall be in Burgdale, and as thou wottest, it is scant a 2 days' journey thence to shadowy vale. Therewith he turned to those men again, and said, Kinsman Crow, depart now, and use all diligence with thy message. So the messengers began to stir, but Bale cried out, Ho! Folk-Mote, my friend, I perceive thou art little changed from the man I knew in shadowy vale, who would have his dinner before the fowl were plucked. For shall I not go back with these thy messengers, so that I also may get all ready to wend to the Mote-House of shadowy vale? But the bride looked kindly on her, and laughed and said, Sister Bale, his meaning is that thou shouldest abide here in Silverdale till we depart for the folk thing, and then go thither with us. And this I also pray thee to do, that thou mayst rejoice the hearts of thine old friends, and also that thou mayst teach me all that I should know concerning this fair child of my brother and my sister. And she looked on her so kindly as she caressed the babe, that Bale's heart melted, and she cried out, Would that I might never depart from the house wherein thou dwellest, O bride of my kinsman. And this that thou biddest me is easy and pleasant for me to do. But afterwards I must get me back to Burgdale, for I seem to have left much there that calleth for me. Yea, said Folk-Mote, and art thou wedded, Bale? Shalt thou never bend the yew in battle again? Said Bale soberly, Who knoweth, chieftain? Yea, I am wedded now these 2 years, and not I looked for less when I followed those twain through the wild wood to Burgdale. She sighed therewith, and said, In all the dale there is no better man of his hands than my man, nor any goodlier to look on, and he is even that Heart of Highcliffe whom thou knowest well, O bride. Said the bride, Thou sayest sooth, there is no better man in the dale. Said Bale, Sunbeam bade me wed him when he pressed hard upon me. She stayed a while, and then said, Face of God also deemed I should not naysay the man. And now my son by him is of like age to this little one. Good is thy story, said Folk-Mote. Or deemest thou, Bale, that such strong and goodly women as thou, and women so kind and friendly, should forbear the wedding and the bringing forth of children? Yea, and we who may even yet have to gather to another field before we die, and fight for life and the goods of life. Thou sayest well, she said. All that hath befallen me is good since the day whereon I loosed shaft from the break of the bent over yonder. Therewith she fell a musing, and made as though she were hearkening to the soft voice of the bride caressing the new-come baby. But in sooth neither heard nor saw what was going on about her, for her thoughts were in bygone days. Howbeit presently she came to herself again, and fell to asking many questions concerning Silverdale and the kindred, and those who had once been thralls of the Dusky Men. And they answered all duly, and told her the whole story of the dale since the day of the victory. So Bale and the carles who had come with her abode for that half-month in Silverdale, guessed in all love by the folk thereof, both the kindreds and the poor folk. And Bale deemed that the bride loved face of God's child little less than her own, whereof she had 2, a man and a woman, and thereat was she full of joy, since she knew that face of God and the sunbeam would be fain thereof. Thereafter, when the time was come, fared Folk-Mote and the bride, and many of the elders and warriors of the wolf and the woodland, to shadowy vale, and Dallach and the best of Rosedale went with them, being so bidden. And Bale in her following, according to the word of the bride.
And in shadowy vale they met Face of God and Alderman Ironface, and the chiefs of Burgdale and the shepherds, and many others, and great joy there was at the meeting. And the Sunbeam remembered the word which she spoke to Face of God when first he came to shadowy vale, that she would be wishful to see again the dwelling wherein she had passed through so much joy and sorrow of her younger days. But if anyone were fain of this meeting, the alderman was glad above all, when he took the bride once more in his arms, and caressed her whom he had deemed should be a very daughter of his house. Now telleth the tale of all these kindreds, to wit, the men of Burgdale and the sheepcotes. And the children of the wolf, and the woodlanders, and the men of Rosedale, that they were friends henceforth, and became as one folk, for better or worse, in peace and in war, in waning and waxing. And that whatsoever befell them, they ever held shadowy vale a holy place, and for long and long after they met there in mid-autumn, and held converse and counsel together. No more as now telleth the tale of these kindreds and folks, but mocketh an ending.